Welcome to our Peninsula Live webinar today. My name's Aileen Dowsavan, and I'm on the events team here at Peninsula Canada. Thank you for taking the time out of your morning to join us today. As Stephanie mentioned, if you have questions for our panelists, you can drop them in the questions box or the chat box below. We are answering live questions during the last 15 minutes of today's webinar, and we'll do our best to get to everyone's questions. We know there are some hot topics that we're going to cover today. In the chance that we can't get back to your question today, a Peninsula consultant will be reaching out to you after the webinar to offer a complimentary consultation with one of our experts here and can answer any outstanding questions or personal questions that you have relating to your business. Next slide. Today's webinar is brought to you by Peninsula Canada. So who are we? As a trusted partner to over 5,100 Canadian businesses, Peninsula Canada keeps small businesses compliant with award-winning HR consulting and health and safety outsourcing. With ever-changing employment legislation, it can be confusing as a small business owner to keep up. And Peninsula makes sure you're compliant and protected. From tailored employment contracts and handbooks, 24/7 advice line, 365 days a year, legal assistance with Peninsula Protect, and Bright HR, our smart people management software. And you can pick a plan that fits the needs of your business. Get a complimentary consultation and learn more about our services. My colleague, as I mentioned, will be in touch after the webinar. Sometimes you just need answers and fast. And that's why Peninsula developed BrainBox. It's been created exclusively for Peninsula clients. It combines powerful AI with 30 years of employment law experience. We get hundreds of questions a week from our clients. That's thousands of questions asked every month. And what our team did for this webinar is we reviewed all of the questions asked and selected the top questions asked to share with you today. Now, why did we pick the top questions asked? Well, because if our client base of 5,100 clients across Canada asked these questions and asked them very recently, then chances are you have these questions and need the answers too. So get your notepad ready to jot down the answers as our team of experts get your business compliance ready for the new year from a health and safety, legal compliance, and HR perspective. First, let me introduce you to our experts, your host, Eddie Haddad, and Lead Business Development Manager here at Peninsula Canada. Eddie's dedicated to helping small and medium-sized businesses manage HR, employment relations, and OHS compliance. He's helped hundreds of businesses access 24/7 HR advice, ensure their employment burdens are taken care of, leaving employers free to see the big picture and focus on the success of the organization. And your panelists, Francis Ibana, Employment Law Content Specialist here at Peninsula Canada. Francis has appeared before the Ontario Small Claims Court, Human Rights Tribunal, Landlord and Tenant Board, and the Labour Relations Board. He has vast knowledge of employment law and other legislation. He also maintains his license as a paralegal and is good standing with the Law Society of Ontario. And Kilian Shukalari, HR advisory expert here at Peninsula Canada. He's an experienced HR professional and a certified human resources leader. Kilian often speaks to the media on HR management issues, with his views featured in leading HR management publications such as HRD Canada, Canadian HR Reporter, and on live news radio stations like News 1130 Vancouver, 680 News Toronto, and Global News radio station. Thank you, speakers, for joining us. Thank you again for our attendees for joining us. Over to you, Eddie.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. We're really excited to help your business grow in this new year. And no better way to do that than to ensure that you are compliance ready. So as mentioned, we will be going through some of the top questions that our clients have asked. And these aren't questions asked by just a few clients. And these are questions asked by hundreds of small and mid-sized businesses of all sizes in all provinces. So how it'll work is that I'm going to bring up a question to one of our experts and we'll provide an answer, as well as share additional insights for you to consider to ensure compliance. When I speak with my clients, maintaining compliance and rules and regulations and laws is probably the hardest part of the day. So we hope that we can bring some peace of mind to you today and providing you with some guidance. Then how I can help. I'm a business development manager, actually a lead business development manager here in Ontario. And I would love to meet with you, learn about your businesses. My colleagues will reach out to you after this webinar. And I really hope that I'll be able to meet each and every single one of you virtually or in person. And then you'll actually get a turn to ask some questions during the webinar. We'll be watching the questions panel, so ask away. We're actually here to help, and we brought our top experts in HR, legal, and we really want to make sure that you have the health and safety support that you need as well. So please engage with us. So to get started, let's kick it off with, do I have time off? Do I have to pay time off due to injury? Well, you know what, that one is definitely something that, we get asked a lot. And I'm going to pass it on to KJ so we can answer this question.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Eddie, this is probably one of the most common questions we get on the line, as you well know. And the short answer, and we usually say, is that you don't. However, it comes with a bit of a explanation. If the injury is related to work, so it's a work-related injury, then the amount of time or the time lost at that point would be covered. If you're part of the WSIB, will be covered by that insurance. If you have any type of sick time, flex time that you provide to your employees, these are things that you can certainly exercise or extend to them. But this will depend on a case-by-case basis. If it's not a work-related injury, then the business has to make a decision. We always say that you can't really go below the employment standards. However, you can go above and beyond.
And when it comes to paying time off due to injury, is it case by case, or do you want to have a set, standard of how you apply these rules?
So obviously, we always advise to have a policy in place. It always goes back to a policy, clear guidelines as to how this applies. You don't really want to be dealing with this at the moment that it happens. Everyone at that point should be aware of what the next steps would be, how you report it, what kind of expectations the business has, and also in line with a return to work policy as well.
Yeah, and typically that's found in an occupational health and safety manual, that you would have clear expectations on what your business does when there's an emergency or an injury. And it is a mandatory thing to have, in Ontario. Once you reach 5 employees, you are mandated to have an occupational health and safety manual. At 6 employees, you also require to have a health and safety rep. That can't be a manager, by the way. Right. And then once you get to 21 employees, you're required to have a joint health and safety committee. So safety is one of the things that, from where we like to say HR is very gray, health and safety is very black and white. Right. And not having these things and not following certain procedures when things happen can put you in some, hot water, as we like to say. All right. So we'll skip to the next questions. Thank you very much, KJ, for that. So do I have to pay for all my employees' training? This is something I get every single day. You hired a new employee, they have to do some mandatory WMIS, violence and harassment, AODA, ministries 4-step for employees and 5-step for supervisors. Do I have to pay my employees to do this training? Can't they just do it at home? KJ?
Yeah, so this also, as all of the questions will be today, very common. It will depend on the type of business you're in. The mandatory trainings, the ones that certainly as an employer, you have to have everyone trained on to conduct the job safely. Those are things that are your responsibility. But there might be certain positions, certain roles where there is expectations on the individual to have a certain amount of training and certifications prior to being able to even apply for the job or be considered for the job. In that case, that the responsibility falls on the employee. With regards to trainings that are maybe optional for an individual, those are things that you can certainly put in place, but we also recommend to have, for example, a service commitment agreement for example. So there's a certain training that you believe, and we find this on the calls all the time. Employees are going to get this training, we're going to pay for it, and then they go and take this somewhere else, and that will help them to get their next best job. You can have what we call service agreements or service commitment agreements, where you expect the employee to pay it back if they leave after a certain amount of time. So the longer they stay, the less they have to pay back. But when it comes to the common question about the trainings, yes, there are certain trainings, as you mentioned, in line that are the responsibility of the employee to make sure that their employees conduct themselves at work in a safe manner. Those are responsibility of the employer. Anything above and beyond would be the employee's responsibility.
Yeah, and the way I usually approach this with business owners is it's day one training, right? So this is training that you're going to do when you're onboarding them to the business. This is training when you're actually training them how to do their job. So, a lot of businesses, what they'll do is they'll tell their employees on how to do this training. And then during downtime throughout that day, they're expected to actually do this work. And usually we set a deadline. I'd like this done by the end of the day or by the end of tomorrow during training. And so this way, it's not a separate period of time, and it just worked into your regular training. It is, though, very important from a compliance point of view to ensure that they do, this training. For example, workplace violence and harassment is probably one of the biggest issues that we have to deal with on a daily basis. Having your employees not have workplace violence and harassment training, an actual certificate of completion, it can't just be a policy that you have in your manual, is a compliance issue. And for example, if you are dealing with a workplace violence and harassment situation in your workplace and your employees have not done this training, then there's some very high risks and liabilities to your businesses. But KJ, you're right. The amount of times we get calls about someone who just spent thousands of dollars for training for one of their employees, and then they're quitting is really high. So ensure that you have the right documentation that's been properly drafted that gives you some legal protection in case that were to happen. All right, so we're going to move on to the next question. So what do I do when an employee refuses unsafe work? Now, you know what? This is something that we hear all the time. You can't just go and fire them. Okay, so you have to make sure that, first of all, you are providing a proper occupational health and safety manual, something called safe work procedures, okay? And then also having clear steps on how to provide a safe workplace. And that really has to do with clear documentation, policies, addressing their concern, training, and that way you're really able to provide, the right set of skills for that employee to ensure that they are safe. Now, there are some times where, them claiming, for example, that their workplace is unsafe may be unreasonable. And so how would that work, KJ? What do I do when an employee refuses unsafe work in that case?
So in most of the cases, especially when it has to do with something related to the whole environment with regards to your work space, maybe let's take a manufacturing setting, for example. Maybe it might be related to temperature, maybe a machine that's not operating properly, or there is maybe parts of the machine or equipment that is not operating properly. These are things that you want to take seriously. And in most cases, if this is something severe, you want to be able to have a conversation with the ministry. So you'd have to report this to make sure that you're taking the right steps and satisfying the employee's expectation that every measure has been put in place to make sure that everything is operating safely. Once you have reported and responded to the employee's concern, you provide them with an understanding of what have you done to make sure that everything has been set up safely. Then you move forward with any type of training, as you mentioned, that might be required in this case, and setting clear expectations. Everything has to go back to what you originally mentioned, which is the steps. For every type of scenario, everyone needs to be on the same page as to what steps you will take, how you'll report at the end of the day, the conclusions of this, if need be investigation or reporting, and then you go forward with day-to-day activities.
Yeah, and KJ, I don't feel that any business is immune to this type of question, right? During COVID, a lot of us felt had calls that people felt unsafe to come to work, right? In an office setting, they have a colleague that may have been vaxxed or may have not been vaxxed, and each side were upset at the other at one point, right? Or, for example, there's hostility between employees, and one of the employees feels that it's unsafe for them to come into work, or weather, for example, right? So really, there is no business that is immune to this type of issue, and you need to be prepared. It's not only high-risk jobs, and honestly, in most cases, it's not the high-risk jobs where people are making these complaints. It is the office setting. Right? It is, smaller businesses. Typically in construction, people know what they're getting into, right? And they have the training and they have the expertise and so on to enter that workplace. Doesn't mean that things don't happen, right? When you don't have a safe workplace. But this is an all business issue, and you should be prepared. And really, that's what we focus here on Peninsula, ensuring that you prevent problems from happening in the first place. And then when they do, addressing them in a way that protects not only your business, but it protects the employee as well. So we're going to move to our next question. So how do I do a workplace violence and harassment investigation? So this is the big one, believe it or not. This is something that at some point in your workplace, you are going to have to deal with, right? It can be something minor. When it comes to harassment, a lot of it does have to do with feelings, okay? How do people feel when maybe a word was said? How do people feel when something happened? Do they feel threatened? Do they feel bullied? And so we really have to look at workplace violence from a broader scope. And then you also need to look at it from a compliance point of view. Who's going to do this investigation? Am I able to do this investigation? Is my colleague able to do this investigation? Do I have too close a relationship with the person I'm investigating? Is there a conflict of interest? Can they say that this investigation was biased in any way, shape, or form? So those are some of the questions that you need to ask yourself prior to doing a workplace violence and harassment. But again, it all goes back to having clear policies in your occupational health and safety manual. This is an OHS issue. This isn't an HR issue, right? Although you may have policies in your HR manual when it comes to workplace violence and harassment, but typically this will fall on the occupational health and safety side. And so you want to ensure that you have clear policies and a clear set of procedures of what happens, how to report a workplace violence and harassment investigation, right? After that reporting, how does an investigation take place? So KJ, I just touched on this a little bit, but there's two types of investigations as far as I know. There's an internal investigation, and then there's one held by a third party. What's the difference, and when do you want them to be handled separately?
Yeah, so Eddie, you mentioned earlier bias, you mentioned conflict of interest. Those are typically the reasons that you'll push you to engage a third party, so an external third party, to help with the investigation. So apart from the bias and the conflict of interest, it might be a concern of not having the capabilities internally or the know-how on how to do this. So you mentioned the documentation, you mentioned the policy. That policy and documentation will outline exactly how an individual would go about reporting, who they would be reporting to, what would be the next steps in that process. So usually you would have an interview with the individual that's reporting a concern, and then with the other individuals involved, either the aggressor or the bully, and so forth. So once everyone is aware of the steps that need to be taken, then as a business, you can certainly go ahead and proceed. Internal investigations are ones that a lot of businesses that have the capabilities and the headcount would usually do. There's a designated individual, usually from the HR department or health and safety, they'll conduct those. However, if the owner of the business, as you mentioned, is involved, or someone higher up is involved, then it does not really look well if a lower rank individual is doing that investigation. So that's why you want to engage a third party. Eventually, as we said, the interviews will happen. There's going to be a result of the investigation. There's going to be recommendations. There's going to be a communication to both individuals, the one that is being accused and the accuser, or the victim. Will have to have an understanding of what the expectations are moving forward. And then it turns into an HR conversation, because then you have to act on the recommendation. So it's a bit of a two-way communication to begin with, and then turns into two action points. From a health and safety standpoint, if you need to update anything in terms of your policies, maybe something is not accounted for. And then from an HR standpoint, in action, all the recommendations.
And that's it, right? When it comes to HR, it's not always black and white. When it comes to OHS, as I mentioned, it's very black and white. Here's a recommendation, and now there's an HR consequences to that decision, right? And that's where you have to make those real decisions. Are we going to discipline? Are we going to terminate? If we terminate, what's the risk to our business? Right. And so making sure that you have a strong OHS documents that work with your HR documents and policies and procedures is how you ensure that you're creating a full compliance business. And that's very, very important. And you know what? You're absolutely right, KJ. The rule of thumb, if an owner, a manager is involved, a third party, and it's something we do here at Peninsula. We typically, even for our clients that we represent, we will send an investigator that does an impartial investigation for them. And then at the same time, once that report's created, that investigator is completely, has nothing to do with decision on the HR matters at hand. And then they use our services to actually get advice for the HR situation. And so it becomes a very, a great support system when dealing with something as high risk as workplace violence and harassment. All right, we're going to move to the next question. That's a great question. Maybe not the greatest topic, but very important. Now, how do I create a return to work program for an injured employee? Now, this is very, very important, okay? An injured employee typically can be a regular injury, but it can be something that happened at home. It could be mental health. There's many different types of situations where you're going to want to have a return to work program, not just generally for a regular injury like someone hurt themselves. And so you really want to make sure to have this return to work program clearly articulated on the processes you would have, so you're able to ensure that moving forward, everybody's treated fairly. Everybody's treated the same. The last thing you need is someone hurts themselves, although all injuries and things like that may be different, and they get special treatment where someone else does it. Now, KJ, creating a return to work program for an injured employee can be pretty simple if they have the right documents and policies in place. How would you go about this?
Yeah, so we always mention that you want as little as possible surprises with every type of process, concern, event that you have within the workplace. Before we say how you go about creating one, let's talk about the two different types. There could be one return to work program that you have to manage and build and update on your own as an employer. This would be in cases where the injury is not related to work. In that way, it's between yourself and the employee. You need to make sure that you are reporting correctly internally. You're keeping track and updates on any type of doctor's communications that the employee will bring forward. You're making sure that the employee is progressing with a proper return, and also setting expectations. What's going to change? If there's an accommodation required, will this be a phased return to work? So this is when you're working on your own. Those policies, the original policies, are very important because they will tell your team and your employees as to what to expect and how we'll progress. But there's the other side where there's a third party involved, and usually it's WSIB. In that case, you'll have three-way communication. The WSIB's mandate is to return the employee to work as soon as possible, so they will certainly help you with any type of reporting and also a return to work program. It might be light duties to begin with. You'll have an individual, depending on the office, the type of, or the environment that you have, you'll have an individual that might come to work and just do maybe very basic duties until they're back to full potential. And again, WSIB, doctor, employee, and yourself will work together towards a proper return to work. It might require some time, but there's going to be a schedule. There's going to be a structure. So that's all you want to have in place: structure, expectations, and then finally having a successful return to work.
Thank you so much, KJ. All right, so those were some of the top occupational health and safety questions. Now we're going to actually move on to our top legal questions with my colleague, Francis. So Francis, you're up. All right, so let's hop right into this. Okay, the first question is verbal notice of termination enough? This I get all the time. I was very angry with my employee. They did something wrong and I fired them on the spot over the phone. How does that work? Is that enough? What can you do there in that situation, Francis?
Thanks for having me, Eddie. Yeah, so generally, no, verbal notice of termination is not enough. So depending on where you're located, so which province, the applicable employment standards legislation will state if the notice you give must be provided in writing or not. So for example, Ontario, British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, the legislation states that if an employee has been employed for more than 3 months, the employer must provide written notice of termination. So other provinces such as like Manitoba, the legislation is quiet. It doesn't say it has to be in writing. But even if written notice of termination is not required by law, it is best practice still. It is always recommended to have everything documented in writing to ensure that you have that paper trail in the event an employee commences some sort of legal action or files a complaint with the labor board against you for anything such as like additional notice. So the go-to is that if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. So the best thing to do is have it in writing.
Fantastic. That's great answer. Listen, the fact is, hiring and firing is part of any business. So make sure you're doing it right will prevent you from having future claims. All right, so let's hop on to the next question. What is a termination payment? Now, this is something that business owners, I find, want to avoid at all costs, right? But there are needs for termination pay in a lot of cases. And so you really want to ensure, first of all, that we have proper contracts in place. I like to call a contract a prenup, right? We know what's going to happen if this marriage or relationship is going to end. And that's where you usually will highlight a lot of the things, what will happen in termination, like termination pay. What is termination pay, Francis?
So termination pay is just like what it sounds like. It's a payment for that employee receives if their employment is terminated for without cause. So when you terminate an employee, you have 3 options. The first one is that you can provide them written notice of termination. So just like we discussed, you terminate them by providing them some sort of written document, and then the employee works through their notice period. The second option is that you can provide termination payment in lieu of the notice. And then the last option is a mix of both. So for example, if the employee is entitled to 2 weeks notice, you can pay them for 1 week, and then they would work out the notice for the second week. So when these situations happen, when you have to terminate an employee and have to give them notice, it is more common for employers to provide termination in payment in lieu of the working notice, because sometimes it can kind of get awkward with the employee working through their notice period after the employment relationship has ended. So it's often
a lot of problems, you mean?
Exactly. Oh yeah, it can cause a lot of problems, and so it's just easier to provide that employee with the termination pay instead of providing the working notice, so their employment ceases immediately.
And really that termination notice or payment can be can change dramatically depending on what type of documentation you have. So just as I mentioned, a contract is like a prenup. Not having a contract means that your employees will fall under something called common law. Common law looks at actually an Ontario Supreme Court case called the Bardell case, Bardal. And that looks at someone's age, ability to find work, all these different factors. So instead of, maybe owing them 1 week per year of service to a maximum of 8 after 8 years, you have to look at that common law entitlement. And so that entitlement switches from being 1 week to almost 2 to 6 weeks per year, right? With no cap. So if I have an employee that's, let's say, in their 60s, have been working there for 10 years, I'm looking at closer to 60 weeks of entitlement rather than the 8 that they would have been owed if they had a proper contract in place. And so when it comes to a termination payment, the most important thing you can do to your company to protect itself is ensure that, number one, you have contracts. But not only contracts that have been recently updated. For example, in Ontario 2 years ago, there was Wagsdale versus Sweden. This was a landmark case where there was a without cause termination clause that got thrown out by the judge. The issue is this is how we all wrote our contracts, right? And so we ended up sending thousands of new contracts to our clients to ensure that they have the most updated documents possible. Because the last thing you need is a false sense of security. I have a contract. They've been using it for a couple of years, and then that will get thrown out in court as well. So we recommend, whenever you give a raise or things like that, that you're always instituting an updated contract to ensure that termination payment is at the lowest possible threshold. So we're going to hop to the next question. Thank you, Francis, for that. So what is termination without notice? This one gets a bit confusing because we just talked about, a notice period. What do you mean by without notice?
Yeah, so a termination without notice is often referred to as a termination for just cause. So as we discussed, when you terminate an employee without cause, you must provide them written notice, whether that's according to the employment standards legislation or a common law. However, when you're terminating an employee for cause, you're not required to provide them with anything. You don't have to provide them with notice. You don't have to provide them with termination pay. So with cause terminations results when an employee commits an act or several acts of severe or willful misconduct, neglect, or incompetence that renders the employment relationship irreparable. So the employment relationship can't be saved because the employee did something so severe. So some common examples of this behavior that would warrant just cause termination are such as theft or violence towards a coworker. So with cause terminations are often referred to as, I guess you can say, the capital punishment of employment law. This is the most severe thing that an employer can do to an employee. So they tend to be very difficult to prove, whether that's in court or before the labor board. So the threshold to prove with cause termination is high because the terminated employee is deprived of this termination pay working notice that they would have been entitled to if they didn't cause some sort of severe misconduct. And at the same time, if they are terminated without or terminated with cause, they are not often unable to receive EI earnings or EI benefits. So in addition to just cause, there are other times where termination without notice is acceptable, such as during the legislative probation period. So if the employee is on a probation period that is compliant with the employment standards legislation, or if the employee has a fixed term contract, such as there is an end date agreed upon by both you and the employee.
So this is a huge issue. A lot of employers think that they can fire an employee with cause willy-nilly. The fact is, pardon my country language there, but I did grow up, in Leamington. So the fact is, when you terminate somebody without cause, with cause, it's probably your highest risk for a lawsuit, right? You really need to ensure, first of all, I wouldn't even touch that. If I had no contracts or employee handbook that explains what a disciplinary policy is or what a with cause termination is, you don't have a leg to stand up at that point, right? Because a lot of this, you got to think HR is evidentiary in nature, right? You have to have evidence, right? And if you are, terminating somebody for a policy that they've never seen, it's very difficult to hold up in court. So most employers will go with without cause, and then get something like a full and final release drafted. So there are, instances where you have to do a with cause termination, but make sure you have the right evidence, right documentation to protect your business, so you don't end up, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars for an expensive Bay Street lawyer for something that could have been easily prevented. All right, so let's move to the next question. So is a settlement agreement the same as a severance package? You know what? I'm not too sure about this. What do you say, Francis?
So actually, no, they're different. So a settlement agreement is different from a severance package. A settlement agreement is a document used to resolve disputes between parties by coming to an agreement by you and the employee. The document often
So, for example, you fired me with cause, and I was really upset, and I filed a claim against you.
Exactly. That's if you guys want to resolve this without having to go through the claim process, you can come to an agreement, and this document, a settlement agreement, is what you guys would agree to and sign it. So that's essentially what a settlement agreement is. But it also includes other additional things, such as like the terms of settlement, like what is agreed upon, if there's any money being exchanged, if there's any confidentiality clauses. So it could also maybe mean benefits that continue. Most employers provide benefits there for their employees, so the employee would be entitled to additional benefits, or even like a reference letter too. So from my past experience, the vast majority of, say, wrongful dismissal claims settle long before they ever get to trial or go before the labor board. They generally come to some sort of settlement agreement, which is in writing. And then on the other hand, which you mentioned was a severance package. So a severance package is typically what people are referring to as when they're talking about the termination package. The termination package is comprised of like the notice of termination or the pay in lieu of notice. So whatever that termination payment is. It may also include anything else, such as like outstanding vacation pay or statutory pay. So the only thing is that there's actually a difference between severance pay and termination pay. So in Ontario, and actually for federally regulated employers, so say if you're in the business of interprovincial trucking, there's actually a difference between the two. So termination pay is regards to how much notice they're going to give or receive, but severance pay is something additional and on top of that, which is additional pay for generally how long the employee has worked for. So just if you are an employer who is operating federally or in Ontario, it is important to remember that there is a difference between the two.
Thank God we have you guys 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because these are tough questions, and I could see how easy it is for a business to maybe get lost in this. So, all right, we are, moving really, I can't believe we're already 40 minutes in, so we're moving really quickly in here. So what is wrongful dismissal claim? We've been talking about this the last couple questions. What does that mean? So in my opinion, it's typically when you fire someone and that they feel that it was unjust that you fired them. Or, for example, maybe you changed their hours and pay, or that's constructive dismissal, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's actually a combination of all the things you actually mentioned. So a wrongful dismissal claim occurs when an employee is terminated without the proper notice, or they feel that they were improperly terminated without the proper notice. So generally, there are three main types of wrongful dismissal claims. The first one, which I just mentioned, is that the employer failed to provide adequate notice, whether that's going to be according to the employment standards legislation or a common law. The second occurs if where an employer inappropriately terminates the employee for just cause, but then fails to provide them with any notice. And then the third occurs when an employer constructively dismisses an employee by significantly and unilaterally altering a fundamental aspect of their employment. So let's say, for example, the employer unilaterally by themselves just changes their hours, they reduce their hours significantly, or they reduce their pay significantly. That is what we call constructive dismissal, a change in the employment contract. So the best way to protect yourself as an employer against wrongful dismissal claims are to ensure that you're providing the proper notice of termination in line with the legislation or common law. So if you have an employment contract that minimizes the termination pay or notice, that is very good. And then the other one is ensuring that you have adequate evidence or proof. If you've terminated an employee with cause, just like you mentioned, Eddie, you need to have evidence, documentation, whatever you need to prove just cause termination. And then the last one would be ensuring that if you do significantly change a fundamental aspect of an employment contract to avoid that constructive dismissal, that there should be written consent. So you want the employee to agree to the changes that you want to make. So in situations where you terminate an employee and you don't want them to come after you for whatever reason, you may want to suggest offering the employee a full and final release, which you kind of mentioned earlier as well. This will bar them from commencing any legal claims against you. So we always recommend when you do have a full and final release, you offer a little bit more money in exchange for that signed release, for that, I guess, added peace of mind.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Francis. All right, so we are moving along, and I appreciate your help. So we're going to actually go over some of the top HR questions right now. Now, being mindful of time, we do want to answer some of your questions as well. So we're going to run along as fast as we can on these stuff. There's just so much to cover when it comes to HR. And that's the benefit of Peninsula, is that you have access to 24 hours, 7 days a week support. KJ's team of experts are always there and able to answer any one of these questions, whether it's 3 a.m., Christmas Day, New Year's, or any time of day. And typically our response time is anywhere between, I would say, 8 to 10 seconds. We'll pick up the phone and you'll talk to an expert like KJ. So KJ, let's move along so we can get to some of the other top questions we have. So do part-time workers get the same amount of vacation as full-time workers?
Well, yes, they should be getting the same amount of vacation, but it all depends on the amount of days that they work. Sometimes part-time could mean that an individual still comes in every day of the week, but they don't have full hours, for example. When we are providing the vacation entitlements for a full-time individual, usually it starts with the 2 weeks. You go over the 5 years, then it goes into the 3 weeks. The same could happen for a part-time worker. However, if they don't have a regular schedule where they're coming Monday through Friday, then that calculation that usually is used in Ontario would produce a lower amount of days. When it comes to pay, though, because this is usually where the question arises, pay is always subject to the 4% or the 6%, depending on length of employment, and based on your earnings.
Yeah, and how you pay is really dependent on the contract, whether it's, on their regular pay or it is accrued and paid out during that time. All right, so let's move to the next question. So do I have to let employees carry over unused vacation? It is January and February, and we are dealing with this question daily. KJ, do they?
Legislation does not provide any guidance or does not allow any carryover. However, as we know, times are tough. There's a bit of a retention concern with some of our employees. You could have a policy in place that does allow carryover. Our recommendation is to have some parameters around it. You can carry over a certain amount of days, not all of them. They need to be scheduled or used by March, let's say, of the following year. As long as you have some parameters, it should be good, but legislation does not have any type of guidelines with regards to carrying over vacation per se.
So the quick answer is no, but you need to have documents in place, right? So if you're doing that, then you want to make sure that you have clear policies that explain this and that treat everybody equally, or ensure that exceptional circumstances are documented as well. For example, COVID, right? That was an exceptional circumstances that a lot of businesses made some exceptions for. All right, so let's move along to our next questions. Can I hire a family member? Well, this one's a pretty common sense one. Absolutely. Most businesses are family run businesses that start from the family. I know my family, we own several businesses that are family run and operate, and we're very proud of that. But KJ, how does an employer deal with this? And then also, how do they deal with not ratting on them to mom when they mess up?
So this is a very good one. But like you said, there's no legislation under the employment standard that prevents anyone from hiring family members. You just want to make sure that you have proper policies and guidelines in place, a proper onboarding process where everyone is aware that if there's to be a dispute, as a family, you would resolve things a certain way. In a business, there is a hierarchy, there is expectations, there's responsibility on safety and conduct. So you want to make sure that everyone is aware of these expectations. And if things were to go south, as we usually say, then everyone is aware of the steps that the business will take, or whoever is in charge will have to take. This goes back also to our external investigations or options when it comes to situations like this, because there's certainly bias and conflict of interest.
Absolutely. If there's a workplace violence and harassment situation, you investigating your brother or sister or parent is not going to fly. And so really, having a strong family environment for all your employees, including your actual family members, is very important. But it is important to have that documentation in place to solve disputes. It's not Christmas dinner. You can't, throw the gravy around when it comes to a business, because there are liabilities that can affect you on a very legal way. All right, so let's hop to question 14. Can I dismiss my employee for being late? The quick answer is I wouldn't jump to conclusions right away. The long answer I'll leave to KJ.
Yeah, so basically, let's start step by step. The first time that it happens, maybe, and again, take into account that you have clear policies on absences and lateness and so forth, the first time would not be something that we would recommend doing. However, there are those scenarios where someone being late or being absent from their workspace or their responsibilities might put others at risk. So it all depends on the setting. However, generally speaking, if we're to go generally speaking, no. However, if the individual continues to be late, continues to not comply with the policy, you can apply what we call progressive discipline, and that technically should lead to a possible termination, or if not, suspension.
All right, fantastic. So now, when it comes to vacation, though, can I force my employees to use their vacation time? That'll be our final question for our HR segment.
Yeah, so it's the employer's responsibility to make sure that everyone is taking vacation. There are those employers that have clear policies and expectations. They put reminders on a regular basis when individuals need to take vacation. But at times, you might have a situation where you have a period of time that you want to close your business. For example, at the end of the year or during a certain period of time, you can certainly mandate that individuals take vacation around that time.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And this is very important to know that at the end of the day, vacation time is at employer's discretion. And so you have to make sure that you're allotting this vacation based on your needs and usually based on clear policies. All right. Thank you so much, KJ. Now we're going to go rapid fire on these next quick questions. So these were recently asked questions by some of our clients. So let's hop to our first one. So can I reduce my employees' pay? Who wants this? Francis, KJ? Francis, let's go.
I'll take this one. So kind of what I mentioned earlier is that while you are entitled to reduce your employees' pay, it has to be reasonable, and you need written consent. If you significantly reduce your employees' pay, especially without consent, they can view this as constructive dismissal and commence a wrongful dismissal claim against you for termination pay and other damages.
So that's a quick no. All right, let's hope to our next question. So can I fire someone for taking sick days? KJ?
I'll go back to my answer earlier with regards to the lateness. No one can be fired for taking sick days. However, if we have a situation where the individual persistently calls in sick, they are unjustified, they're not providing doctor's notes, the extent to which the sicknesses are happening, or the amount of time and length without any type of communication or clear communication or guidance for the employer could certainly result in termination. So it all depends on how you want to engage with your individuals. If policies are clear, expectations are set, individuals are not complying, it takes two to tango. If you're not being cooperative with the employer that's just trying to make sure that you have a safe return to work whenever you're calling sick, then the employer sometimes is left with no choice.
Absolutely. And it is a high risk situation when you are trying to fire someone for a health reason. It could be a human rights situation. So my best advice is call an expert and make sure that they're helping you deal with that. That's what we do all the time here at Peninsula. We make sure that we're holding your hand through these difficult decisions that really can, mean the difference between you having a human rights complaint and you not. All right, so let's move to our next question quickly. Now, how do I prevent workplace injuries? You know what, gentlemen, let me take this one. This one's very important to ensure that you have a proper occupational health and safety manual, that you have the mandated training like WMIS, violence and harassment, AODA, but the ministry's 4-step and 5-step training are very important to have. The 5 steps for your supervisors and the 4-step is for your employees. And you want to have clear, policies when it comes to safety, especially when it comes to safe work procedures, right? What to do in a certain situation, for example, I'm mopping. Do I have the right signage, right? Or I'm on a construction site, or my employees are driving. How do I, or if they're working from home, what type of policies do I have from work from home? Work from home does not mean you are, excused from having an occupational health and safety policies and manuals, mental health policies, ergonomic policies. There's so much there. So you really need to ensure that your OHS manual is regularly updated and you're ready to go. All right, let's hop to the next question. So 19, how long does someone have to be employed before they're entitled to sick pay? Oh, this one's a tough one. KJ?
Well, I mean, legislation states 2 weeks of continuous employment, but again, it goes back to what you have in place. You could have a higher, benefit as the employment standard says, but in Ontario, that's the basic requirement.
Yeah. Okay, so perfect. In Ontario.
Yes,
I would like to, if I don't mind to chime in. Yes, in please. Ontario, actually, there is no legislation for sick pay necessarily. It's actually sick leave is unpaid in Ontario. However, in BC, if you're an employer in BC, their employees are entitled to 5 paid sick days under the legislation after 90 consecutive days of employment. And then after that, they're entitled to 3 additional unpaid leaves. And then further to what KJ mentioned, it's good. You can provide additional benefits of, say, sick pay in your employment contract. And that would be a way to provide that. Yeah.
And I think just the final point on this, make sure you know if you're federally or provincially regulated. A federal employer now has to pay their employees 10 sick days. And so that can be a very big amount to consider. All right, so the final question will be, can I monitor what employee is doing on a work phone?
I could take this one. So since work phones are company property, you're allowed to monitor your employees' activities, say like any correspondence being sent, like text messages, emails, or even like websites that they visit. So the laws about monitoring an employee's work phone are just, I guess, developing actually recently in Ontario as of October of 2022. Employers in Ontario who have 25 or more employees must establish a electronic monitoring policy. So how they're monitoring their employees through, say, computers or laptops, work phones. So this policy must be detailed extensively Whereas, say, in other provinces like BC, Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, employers don't need to have such a policy, but they still can monitor their employees' activities on work devices.
Thank you so much. That was incredible. And you know what? How can you keep up with all this? That's the important question. You have a duty to care for your staff. You're responsible for their well-being while they're at work. You have to keep up with ever-changing employment and health and safety legislation. An inspector could drop by any day, just to check in to ensure that you're complying with laws and regulations. All this is while you're still running your business and you have all of the other duties that you do. And really, that's where Peninsula can help you, right? Peninsula is able to help with HR and employment relationships. Peninsula's team of expert advisors is available round the clock to offer HR advice, help you manage your employee management matters that may arise, right? Health and safety, keeping you up to date with changing rules and regulations. This is why we provide 24/7 support to address every aspect of occupational health and safety, as well as HR. We customize, we create, documentation with our HR consultants and our occupational health and safety experts, that's specific to your businesses. We draft your contracts, we draft your handbooks, we draft your policies and documents for you. We draft the response to that weird text message you got from Bob that you don't know how to reply. Our experts are always there to help you identify any potential issues with wording and when it comes to our policies. And now we offer online HR software, through Bright HR. It's an award-winning smart HR software that simplifies daily HR tasks. You can use Bright HR for absence management, to log attendance, book vacations, time off, track staff hours, plan schedules, manage payroll, so much more too. And it's also available on your smartphone. So me as an employee, when I need to request some time off, I hop on my app, toss it in there, and it goes to my boss to approve or deny it. We also offer online health and safety software called Bright Safe and Bright HR. It's a health and safety management system. And I think what's really nice is that all the mandatory trainings are on there for your employees, so you don't have to worry about where to go to ensure that I'm compliant. And I think one of the biggest things that we offer is called Peninsula Protect. Peninsula Protects is a service promise we offer to our clients, which protects your business up to $125,000 per claim for legal fees, up to $500,000 per year. It doesn't include pre-existing matters, but the whole point, you're using our docs and our advice. We want to make sure you're supported from beginning to end. This can save your company hundreds of thousands of dollars over the long term. We all know how expensive lawyers are, especially in Mississauga. And so we want to make sure to prevent those legal fees. And when something happens, we are here to help you. So, we offer, some of the greatest, I think, employment services in the country. We are an award-winning service, and we're going to offer everybody a complimentary consultation. So what we're going to try to do today is Peninsula consultant will call you in the next 1 to 2 business days. You'll receive, a confidential follow-up where we'll actually do a gap analysis of your HR and health and safety policies and procedures. And it's a great, opportunity for you to identify anything that you may have missing and to speak to an expert. So we will be calling you after today, and you can ask us any question during this period of time that we didn't answer today. So we're just going to go quickly to a final poll. So if you are interested in having us call you today, we will reach out to you. So just click on the poll answer so we can reach out to you for a consultation today, or we can follow up within the next few days to save you a spot as well. We are looking forward to meeting each and every single one of you. I am looking forward to meeting you. And what's nice is we already have some of Mississauga's strongest and best businesses as part of the Peninsula team. And we really just want to make sure that all of your MBOT members have access to speak to us. So thank you very much. We look forward to meeting each and every single one of you over the next couple of days. And we can't wait to have our next seminar with you, and we'll be meeting you in person as well over the next coming weeks at MBOT events. Thank you very much for everybody who attended today. Thank you, Francis. Thank you, KJ. Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Stephanie. We really appreciate everyone taking the time to meet with us today. Have a great day.